We are constantly flooded with these positive headlines about the energy transition. Specifically how fast renewable energy costs are dropping.
Yes, solar, wind, batteries, they seem to be hitting price floors years ahead of schedule, it feels like.
Exactly. So here's the puzzle then. If reality is moving this fast, why do the massive official energy system models, the ones governments and utilities rely on for planning, why do they always seem to lag behind?
It's a really key contradiction in modern energy planning, isn't it? And today, well, we're going to tear apart the data that proves this gap exists.
Okay.
We're doing a deep dive into the findings of this huge study. It's titled, Are We Too Pessimistic? Cost projections for solar photovoltaics, wind power, and batteries are overestimating actual costs globally.
Wow, okay. That title doesn't leave much room for doubt, does it? And this study sounds really comprehensive. You said a systematic analysis comparing cost assumptions from, what was it, 40 different studies?
That's right, 40 studies and over 150 scenarios. And they focused on 5 key technologies: utility-scale PV, rooftop PV, onshore and offshore wind, and, really crucially, Li-ion batteries.
Okay.
The projections they looked at run all the way out to 2050. But their main mission was to compare those future estimates against 2 key metrics that reflect market reality today:
Right.
capital expenditures, CapEx, and the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE.
Okay, so let's just cut straight to the core revelation here because it sounds almost staggering. This study confirms that while projections have maybe gotten a bit better recently,
They have improved, yeah.
they're still fundamentally too conservative, way too pessimistic. The global cost reduction for renewables is just moving much faster than these big planning models assume.
And that sort of entrenched pessimism, well, it effectively becomes a brake pad on the whole energy transition. If we plan based on costs that are too high,
Then we plan too slow.
exactly, we plan for transitions that are too slow, potentially missing opportunities.
Okay, before we get into just how big the error is, let's quickly pin down these metrics. We're tracking CapEx and LCOE. Can you just walk us through the difference again?
Absolutely. So CapEx, capital expenditure, think of it as the upfront sticker price.
Yeah.
It's the total investment cost for a project, equipment, installation, getting it hooked up to the grid.
Right.
It's useful for planning because it's relatively straightforward, fewer assumptions involved compared to LCOE, and less susceptible to all the regional financial variations we'll get into.
And LCOE, that's where things get more complicated.
Yeah, it's the holistic measure, yeah. The lifetime view. LCOE is basically what you get when you divide the project's total costs. So CapEx plus decades of operation and maintenance.
Okay.
By the total energy the facility is expected to produce over its entire life. It's the key economic number, really, but the calculation is super sensitive to local stuff. Financing costs, perceived risks in that region. And that complexity is precisely where these projection models often stumble.
And here is the finding that really, I think, needs to sink in for everyone listening. This study suggests that many of the cost projections these models are using for the year 2050 are in the exact same ballpark as the actual market prices we were seeing back in 2024.
We are basically hitting the cost floor they expected for the middle of the century right now. It's kind of mind-blowing when you frame it like that.
That sounds like more than just a little oops, That feels like a structural problem in the forecasting. For instance, the study mentions models projecting investment costs for utility-scale PV in the U.S. for 2050
Go on.
that are 30% higher than the costs we're already seeing today. 30% higher. In the future.
It is stunning. They're essentially forecasting cost increases instead of recognizing this incredibly steep learning curve that's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the specific figures for global utility-scale PV CapEx.
Okay.
The actual average cost hit about $500 per kilowatt, so kilodollars, by the end of 2023. That real-world number, it's lower than almost every projected cost for 2023 found in the scenarios they analyzed. Almost all of them were too high.
And it's not just solar, is it? This cost compression seems to be moving even faster for storage.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Li-ion battery storage CapEx is already kind of hovering around $100 per kilowatt dollars for a standard 4-hour system.
Wow.
And that represents something like a 60% reduction just since 2023. But crucially, that current cost, it's lower than what most studies were projecting for the year 2030.
Okay, wait. So we've basically blown past the 2030 battery targets like 7 years early.
Pretty much.
And we're already undercutting the 2050 solar targets.
Yeah.
So if you're an energy planner and you're relying on these models,
Yeah.
you'd be operating on assumptions that are essentially 10, maybe even 20 years out of date.
That's the implication, yes. It makes effective planning incredibly difficult.
Okay, so if the projections are generally too pessimistic, are they at least sort of agreeing on how slowly costs will drop? Is there consensus there?
Not really, no. Moving into CapEx specifically, while all 40 studies basically agree costs will eventually drop for these technologies, the rate of reduction they predict varies enormously. The disparity is just immense.
How immense?
Well, the most optimistic CapEx projections for solar PV and offshore wind, they're up to 4 times lower than the most pessimistic ones.
A 400% spread for the same technology. How does that even happen? What accounts for that massive variation?
This study points to 3 main drivers, really. First, just using outdated data as a baseline. Second, making wildly different assumptions about the learning rate. How quickly costs fall as you build more capacity.
Right, the more you build, the cheaper it gets.
Exactly. And third, and this is significant, regional soft costs play a huge role. We can see this best if we look at some of the outliers in the projections.
Okay, let's do that. Let's start on the high side. Where do they project the most expensive PV installation costs?
According to the short-term projections they looked at, Egypt came out with the highest projected utility-scale PV cost, sitting at around 1,600 kilowatt-hours for 2025.
Okay, why so high there?
Well, that high estimate seems tied directly to those first 2 points. Lower expected learning rates, mostly because the country just has limited installed capacity compared to global leaders like China or the U.S.
Ah, okay.
Without that sheer volume, you just don't get the same cost efficiencies kicking in.
And then we see a different kind of regional barrier when we look at, say, the U.S. rooftop PV market. The CapEx for that specific segment remains stubbornly high, doesn't it?
It does, and that's where those soft costs really dominate. It's often not the solar panels themselves that are driving the high price tag.
Everything else.
It's everything else.
Yeah.
Higher costs for labor, the complexity of sales and customer acquisition, permitting hurdles, regulatory compliance, all those soft costs add up.
And that translates into less rooftop PV being installed compared to the much bigger utility scale projects.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with China. Their rooftop PV projections are the lowest globally. Is that just about cheaper labor?
Is it?
Well, it seems to be primarily a capacity advantage, driven by really aggressive government policy. China has, over 250 gigawatts of installed solar capacity now? A huge chunk spurred by nationwide incentives going back to 2011.
Right.
They've just generated this enormous learning curve through sheer volume, and the cost efficiency that comes with that scale seems to completely overwhelm the soft cost issues you see elsewhere.
Okay, so it sounds like for solar and batteries, the cost reduction trend is pretty locked in, even if the regional path varies a lot. But the study noted one major exception to that clear downward CapEx trend: offshore wind.
Yeah, offshore wind is definitely the outlier here. The market is simply less mature and far more complex logistically.
Right, building stuff way out in the ocean.
Exactly. So its CapEx is much more volatile. Currently around, say, 3,500 kilowatt market average compared to maybe 1,300 kilowatters for onshore wind. Big difference. The sheer complexity of construction, the much longer lead times for projects, the smaller global market volume overall, and these regional supply chain bottlenecks. It all means its cost trajectory is just much harder to predict accurately right now.
Okay, so if predicting just the upfront CapEx generates that massive fourfold spread, moving to LCOE, which adds in maintenance, expected output, and crucially, financing costs, that must make the projection differences even worse, right?
Oh, it does, absolutely. The LCOE difference between the most optimistic and the most pessimistic projections for solar PV and offshore wind can also be as large as fourfold.
Still fourfold, wow.
For the slightly more mature technologies, like rooftop PV and onshore wind, the difference maybe shrinks a bit, but it's still easily twofold. It makes comparing different studies almost impossible when their basic financial assumptions are so wildly different.
And just like we saw with CapEx, the observed reduction pace for utility-scale PV LCOE is, again, outpacing most of the models.
That's right. Real LCOE data showed a decline down to about $50 per megawatt hour, and another dollars back in 2022. And recent auction prices suggest upcoming projects will be even cheaper than that. The reality is moving fast.
So where does this huge spread in LCOE projections come from then, if it's not just the hardware costs?
Well, this is where we hit probably the most significant structural issue driving that LCOE spread. It often isn't the physical cost of the turbines or the panels themselves anymore. It's the discount rate.
The discount rate.
LCOE projections often use these, frankly, somewhat arbitrary discount rates that just fundamentally fail to reflect the actual region-specific costs of capital and the real risk profiles of these technologies today.
Why does that one input, the discount rate, why does it matter so much for the final LCOE number?
Well, think about renewables.
Yeah.
They are highly capital intensive, right?
Yeah.
You spend most of the money up front to build the thing.
Right.
The discount rate essentially represents the cost of that capital. It's often expressed as the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC.
WACC, okay.
Think of WACC as kind of the minimum rate of return a project has to generate to keep all its investors and lenders happy. And crucially, it reflects the perceived risk of the project.
Ah, perceived risk.
Exactly. So if you assume a higher risk, meaning you use a higher discount rate in your calculation, the technology looks vastly more expensive over its lifetime on paper.
And the study found that those risk assumptions, those discount rates, they vary wildly, even within the same country.
Precisely. Take Iran as an example cited in the study. Discount rates used in different Iranian studies ranged from 7%, which was used in official national energy system planning,
Okay, official number.
all the way up to 18%, which was used by, say, a community group focusing specifically on minimizing current energy costs for themselves. The goal of the person doing the modeling dictates the assumption, which then massively skews how viable the technology looks.
And that variance exists even in highly developed, stable markets. You mentioned Europe.
Absolutely. Within Europe, one study might assume a 10% discount rate, that WACC, for a project, while another study, looking at the very same PV technology, might assume an average of 5%.
Half the assumed cost of capital.
Exactly. And in the U.S., the WACC for mature utility-scale PV is often assumed to be even lower, maybe around 3% these days, because it's seen as a pretty low-risk investment now.
So you're talking about potentially a threefold difference in the assumed financial risk for an identical piece of equipment, depending on who's running the model and why.
That's it. If you use the 10% rate, the project looks risky and expensive. Use the 3% rate, and it looks cheap and like a no-brainer. This huge disparity makes comparing policies or projects across regions extremely difficult.
I also noticed the study highlighted something else, that we aren't always comparing apples to apples when we talk about these high LCOE projections.
That's correct. You have to be careful there. Some studies show a higher LCOE, partly because they're including system-level integration costs.
Like what?
Things like necessary upgrades to the transmission grid, or the cost of adding battery storage to handle intermittency. Those system costs are often excluded entirely from other studies that are just focusing narrowly on the generation asset itself.
So different system boundaries.
Exactly. Without really clear definitions of what's included and what's not the system boundaries, LCOE comparisons can quickly dissolve into, well, just confusion.
Okay, despite all this chronic pessimism and this variability, the study does offer maybe a glimmer of hope. It suggests that newer projections are getting better, that forecasters are maybe starting to pay more attention to the real-world pace.
Yes, that's a positive trend noted. The models are learning, albeit slowly. We can see this pretty clearly by comparing reports from the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, over time.
NREL, right. What did they find?
Well, back in 2015, the NREL Annual Technology Baseline, their ATB report, estimated the average U.S. utility-scale PV LCOE for the year 2050 would be about 91 gigawatts.
$91 for 2050.
Yeah.
Okay. And what is their latest report, the 2024 one, say for that same year, 2050?
The NREL 2024 ATB anticipates an average LCOE of just 21 milliamperes for 2050.
Wow. From 91 wineries down to 21 whirlers.
Yeah, that is a 77% reduction in the projection itself over about 9 years. It shows they're dramatically improving their ability to factor in the learning curve and the real cost compression that's happening.
Okay, a 77% improvement in the forecast is massive progress, you have to admit. But I guess the core conclusion of this study still remains, even with that effort, they are still missing the mark.
They're still fundamentally failing to capture the historical trend accurately, especially at speed. The actual market data shows that solar PV and batteries, which are really the main engines driving this transition forward,
Right.
are achieving cost levels today that weren't expected until 10 or even 15 years from now, even in the most advanced, most optimistic scenarios being published. The models are kind of running on time for a race that finished a decade ago.
So, for you listening, maybe you're a learner, a policymaker, an investor, anyone relying on these large-scale energy system models, what is the ultimate takeaway here? Why should you care that some government model assumed a 10% WACC instead of 3%?
Well, you should care because these persistent cost overestimations, these pessimistic inputs, they lead directly to inaccurate and potentially sluggish planning decisions about how we decarbonize our energy systems.
How so?
If planners assume renewables will be significantly more expensive down the road and that their deployment will peak much later than reality suggests, well, they might delay crucial investments in the necessary grid infrastructure, in transmission upgrades, in integration systems.
Because it doesn't look economic yet, according to their models.
Precisely. And that delay unnecessarily slows down the entire energy transition. And ironically, it could ultimately drive up the long-term cost for everyone by missing the window for cheaper deployment now.
The economic story here seems pretty clear then. The rapid, sustained decline of renewable energy costs is essentially demanding that our financial forecasting catches up. We need to move away from this structural conservatism and reflect the actual market maturity we're seeing. Hashtag tag outro.
So to summarize this deep dive, cost projections for these key transition technologies, solar, wind, batteries, are consistently and often significantly too pessimistic. They are also highly variable.
Right, especially those LCOE projections.
Exactly. That variability is most pronounced in LCOE, and it seems largely driven by these somewhat arbitrary, often overly high, assumptions around discount rates and other regional financial factors rather than the technology cost itself.
And remember the source that really laid all this bare for us today. Are we too pessimistic? Cost projections for solar photovoltaics, wind power, and batteries are overestimating actual costs globally.
And maybe here's a final provocative thought for you to consider building on all this. This study found that just adjusting the assumed discount rate by as little as 5 percentage points.
So that's 5% can lead to LCOE reductions of up to 40% in some cases. Given that sensitivity, what would happen if our energy models started pricing the cost of capital based not on the high-risk assumptions of the past when these were new technologies, but on the rapidly diminishing financial risk that's actually inherent today in highly mature, reliable, and bankable technologies like utility-scale PV? How much faster might the transition look then?